Alright, so we're going to do a few more from the section 6.7. I'll look at like 33. Okay, we have 2w squared is equal to negative 98. So I want to get w by itself. First I need to, if I'm going backwards from PEMDAS, I'll need to divide first and get, that would be negative 98 divided by 2 would be negative 49. And then I need to square root both sides to get the w by itself, because if we're going PEMDAS backwards, exponents would come after the division. Alright, so we'd get w equal, now remember I need to put a plus or minus on this because I square rooted it, okay? So it's plus or minus the square root of negative 49. Remember you can split that up into the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 49. And this would be plus or minus the square root of negative 1 we would write as I, and the square root of 49 is 7. We would write this as plus or minus 7i. You usually put the sign out front, the I on the back, kind of like it was a variable, even though it's not, and then you put the 7 up front. So that's how you do 33. 35 is similar. I won't do that one just because you just solve it the way you would something else. The only thing is you're just going to get a square root of a negative number, and you're going to have that be an I at the end. So let's look at something like maybe 39. 39, the A part says 3 square root of negative 2 minus the square root of negative 50. Alright, it looks like we can't combine this because the radicals are different, but if we simplify it, we're going to find that we can do some combining here. So you have to do each one separately. Now the square root of 2, we can say, well, that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2. And then the square root of negative 1 is I, and then there's square root of 2. So we could write it that way. Sometimes they'll write 3 square roots of 2i or something like that. Something like that maybe. Alright, now let's go to the second one. Square root of negative 50, that's the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 50. So again, we're going to have an I for the square root of negative 1. And the square root of 50, if you think about it, that's 25 times 2. 25 is the biggest square in 50. So that's going to be 5 that comes out front with the I. I'll put it in front of the I, and you'll have a square root of 2 left. So this would be 3 square root of 2i minus 5 square root of 2i if I write it the same way. If I got 3 of those square root of 2i's and I subtract 5 of those square root of 2i's, I end up, and really what my like term is here, in a way, is this whole square root of 2i. 3 of those things minus 5 of those things is negative 2 of those things, square root of 2i. Now the I is not under the radical, just in case. That's one of the reasons why people have different ways of writing it. Sometimes people don't like writing it after the radical because you might accidentally think it's part of the radical. Your book actually, because they don't want you to think that, they write it negative 2i square root of 2. It doesn't. It's all the same thing, but maybe that would be a little less confusing. The B part, I don't know why I'm writing in green. Get to the B part of 39. It's 3 square roots of negative 2 times negative square root of negative 50. Okay, again, we got to be really careful here because we're multiplying. We got lots of negatives, but we got to be careful not to overdo it with the negatives and to take a piece at a time. Now, the square root of negative 2 we could write as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2. That becomes 3i square root of 2. But we're multiplying here times this other term. Now this other term I could also write as negative, and then square root of negative 50 would be the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 50. So you got a negative already, but the square root of negative 1 now is an I, and then you got the square root of 50. Well, we've seen before that that reduces. That's 25 times 2, which becomes 3i times square root of 2 times negative I. And there's a 5 square root of 2, and again I could be writing these in different order, and I'll kind of clean that up now. Alright, so let's see what we got. We got a negative. We got 3 times 5 on the outside is 15. We got an I times an I is an I squared, and we've got a square root of 2 times the square root of 2. Lots of mopping up to do here. Alright, so that's a negative 15, but an I squared is a negative 1. And then this square root of 2 times square root of 2 is just 2. Okay, so now all our i's have gone away, and we have a negative times a negative is a positive. So it would be a positive 15 times 2, which would just be 30 when we get done. All right, and then last, 43 says to simplify and assume that each variable represents a positive number. So they're trying to make it easier on us by saying you don't have to worry about what the sign of the variable is. A lot of times we don't worry about it anyway. We forget to think about it. But here, if we thought about it, it could confuse us. So they're just saying don't think about it. All right. So let's, again, simplify each piece here. Let's do this first term here. We're multiplying, so I'll write it in here. Now, the square root, you could write this as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 12 times the square root of a. And if we keep simplifying that, the square root of negative 1 is an I. The square root of 12, 4 times 3 is 12, and the square root of 4 would be 2 square roots of 3. You need to slow down, go off and do that to the side. And then you got the square root of a. I'm going to leave it broken up like that because we're just going to be multiplying all these pieces together. Let's go look at the second thing we're multiplying here, negative square root of negative 3a. That could be written as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3 times the square root of a if I want to break it into its pieces. Well, the square root of negative 1 is I, and then I got a square root of 3, and I got a square root of a. Okay, let's put things together that go together. You got an I times an I, that's an I squared. We know that's going to be negative 1, right? I'll just do this. Then we got a 2 on the outside. Let me just do the 2 part. Okay. Now I got a square root of 3 here times this square root of 3. That's going to be a 3. Let's keep multiplying. And the square root of a times the square root of the a is square root of a squared, which is just a. They were just wanting us to say, okay, well, we're just going to say it's positive a. It's not plus or minus a or something like that. It's really why they say assume the variable's positive here. All right, so let's clean this up. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2 times 3 is negative 6a. So our answer to 43 is negative 6a.